Welcome back to Beating a Dead Horse. As always, I'm your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And this week, we're dipping into the YA well, as we're talking about The Darkest Minds. I'm assuming that not a whole lot of people have seen this, given that it has a critical review of not very good, and I saw it in a giant AMC, yet we were in the smallest possible theater. That said, it's pretty good, and you should, if you're looking for something to do, go correct that. You know, go give them some money. It was alright.
I found it quite charming, in a lot of ways. It wasn't great, but I found it made me nostalgic for when I was a teenager and in reading and enjoying YA. At which point, I must clarify now for the audience that I have a personal stake in the propagation of young adult literature and movie adaptations thereof, because I am currently trying to sell a YA manuscript. So, if you
go check out his page on Kickstarter.com.
If you know any literary agents, tell them to inquire about a manuscript. No, but so I say this up front only because I know that the way I talk about this movie and the way I talk about the YA scene can't really be separated from the fact that I've got a personal interest in it, and I don't want to have a Gamergate scandal, YA gate for small-time podcaster Jackson Keller, as he tries to praise a movie that not a lot of people saw, so people buy his other book that isn't really like this movie at all.
It's a convoluted set of twists and ideas and whatnot. It's rife for a giant conspiracy theory going on here. All right, guys. So I understand his concern. If someone were to take just a little bit of this and twist it just a certain way, this could all be a whole big thing. And you know what? We'll welcome it because controversy sells downloads. So, come on, bring it on, people.
No, I don't want dildos sent to my house. But yeah, all that's just to say, I got a bias. Here I am admitting my bias, a bias for the YA, and I'm gonna make a case for why you should be too. So
we did mention that it has been getting low review scores, and if you go check out Rotten Tomatoes, it has 16% or something like that. So I'm gonna take a minute and rail against Rotten Tomatoes, or at least the common understanding of Rotten Tomatoes, because I would probably put this movie in the solid C range, B- area. It's fine. It's not stellar or anything like that, but I had some good times with it. There were some enjoyable moments. There were some dark moments that I really liked. But a 16% on Rotten Tomatoes makes me feel like a lot of people kind of had the same feeling about it, and Rotten Tomatoes just read that as a big ol' N from them, and just tanked the score. So never entirely trust Rotten Tomatoes. See what people are saying before you just go, oh, it has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 7.
Oh yeah, no, it's I mean, Jack and Jill has 4%, right? So clearly the fact that it's not 0 means the system must be flawed in some way. But this is not an 18% movie. This is not an F. Like I said, I found it quite charming in a lot of ways. And there are some problems. There are some pretty big problems in both the story and the filmmaking, and a lot of the holes that are pretty obvious from the process of adapting it to the screen. But I would say that this is pretty much emblematic of what's appealing about these YA books and these YA movies. And granted, the book for this came out in 2012, I believe, so it's not really super indicative of what's going on in the scene, finger quotes. But I think it does get to the appeal of why people write these books for like teenagers and kids and younger audiences, and the fact that it's engaging with such dark subject matter, and whether it succeeds or not, I think brings up a lot of interesting questions for how we should approach books and movies like this. But but it's also got some of the trappings and problems that come with these adaptations, just because like the pacing is a big issue. Everything moves at like breakneck speeds. You can tell that the book was kind of chopped up. But the main character feels a little flat, and I was talking about this with my girlfriend afterwards, and she had mentioned that, and immediately, like after just thinking about it for a second, I'm just like, well, having not read the book, you know why that is, right? It's because clearly she was a first-person narrator in the book. That's why they have the voiceover. But you can't have that in the movies. So the fact that she seems kind of like a passive observer a lot of the time is just a consequence of something that is natural in the medium of prose and less natural in the medium of film that, maybe could have used some more fleshing out. It's a good case study, I think, for the whole YA thing, if not necessarily the YA thing, like, as it exists right now. I mean, I could maybe, and I'm by no means an expert, but I'm trying to sell a damn book. I've been keeping my eye on what's popular with the kids these days.
I just want to kind of touch on, you mentioned how it really kind of runs at a breakneck pace, and bear in mind we're still not in spoilers, so don't worry about this at all. But I know my significant other actually has read the book, so I got a little bit of an insight to it afterwards. And she explained that it's not, like, the movie, while definitely taking some creative liberties, managed to maintain a lot of the ideas within the book, and, like, the movie matches the pacing of the book in a lot of ways. Like, there's a whole opening scene that I thought was actually really cool, kind of clever, very Magneto, which, I mean, you should be able to figure out what exactly I mean by that. And it lasted really short, and apparently in the book it lasts all of about maybe a chapter or two. So, like, it's very similar in that regard. Like, it just kind of goes, and there's never really any stopping to it. So, like, that could just be an element of the book itself. The other thing she really mentioned was just that, like, all the changes that they really made from the book to screen felt more like insurance in case the movie didn't do well. She said they all kind of felt like things that were designed to make it wrap up into a nicer package at the end. Kind of like leaving the mystery in case they want to have a sequel, but also nice enough that if it's a standalone, it's not damning of the entire product.
That's interesting about the pacing, because I totally chalk that up on my viewing to, like, just having to cut stuff out, like, and hitting only the really important plot beats. Although it makes sense that the beginning would be just kind of like a prologue, that tends to be how the backstory in these dystopia stories tends to be established.
I mean, yeah, it does make sense, and I'm sure there are other elements of it that were chopped up from book to screen in a similar manner, like to what you were expecting. But, like, the beginning is where I found it most jarring, and it was apparently just part of the story.
Huh. Interesting. Do we want to move into spoilers? Because there's some deaths. There's some deaths and some things that sure happen in this.
There are, yeah. In this young adult novel that they can't say the fuck word in, but they can certainly do some other horrible, horrible things.
So I just want to jump right into it, and not really talk about I think we should talk about the first scene, but I want to talk about...
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the first scene for sure.
The tone more generally, and just my experience watching the movie, because I need to right a wrong. This episode is going to be the redemption of Jackson Keller, because First of all, this is a movie featuring kids, about kids, where I not only did not hate the kids, but was actually quite charmed by them. So I don't hate kids, damn it! I'm not a monster, I promise!
In like 10 minutes, I'm gonna say that I wanted to keep the kids in the concentration camps longer, so don't worry, you got a new villain.
Sean will accept all your hate. So aside from that, I wanted to talk about tone, because after going through and listening to some of our previous episodes and getting kind of called out by my girlfriend, I realized that I tend to talk about tone in very vague and unspecific terms, and it's a common complaint that I often turn to. And she called me out for being inconsistent because I criticized the movie's tone, and she said, well, aren't you a fan of Metal Gear Solid? Isn't that like a tonal nightmare? Like, I've seen you play that. It goes from like gritty war drama to silly stupid ninjas and katanas and stuff. Like, how can you say this? And so I realized that the problem, I think anyway, is not so much that I'm being inconsistent, but that by just saying that the tone is off or it's jarring and not going down into the nitty gritty, it's leaving it too general, and it's not really a full like criticism or a complaint. It's not really super productive. So henceforth, I'm going to try and be more specific when I talk about tone and feeling and not leave it so vague, starting with this episode, because the movie is a bit of a tonal nightmare.
There it is. Check off your bingo sheets, kids.
Yep. And I want to talk about why, because the movie, and you know what, I guess we can just start with that first scene, because it didn't bother me.
I want the kids in concentration camps longer.
Yes, Sean wants the kids in concentration camps longer, and it's I think it's a pretty effective opening, the fact that the first thing we see is just like an elementary school girl like dropping dead. Like that's our intro, and then
let's back up for a second here, just in case, as I said, we might have some people listening to this who don't actually go see the movie, because no one's seeing this movie right now. The basic premise of it is like a bunch of kids get superheroes, and every kid that doesn't get superheroes just dies. And it's wide sweeping. I think like a third of the population of children in the world actually live through this event, because there's not a better word for it. And like a bunch of them get really cool superpowers. Some of them can like shoot fire. Some of them can cause people to do things. Others are just super smart. Some can lift things with their mind, and electricity is the other one. And so like we open on the start of the event. I don't know whether it was a virus or not. It's never actually told.
I'm assuming that's something that's fleshed out in the sequels.
Presumably.
Yeah. And I guess side note, since this isn't super important to the overall point, but while we're talking about like the classification system, was it weird to you that when they finally revealed what the Reds were and why they were killing them instantly, that it was just that they could breathe fire? Because that felt a little weird to me.
It looked really dumb too. I gotta admit that.
I mean, the CGI in the movie is definitely not great. And like, I get it. Like, you know, obviously that's destructive and chaotic, but like, couldn't you do just as much damage with telekinesis? You know?
Oh yeah, like the power structure is just absurd. And like, there's some. Barring even that, at one point somebody says without kids the economy fell apart, which made no sense either. But
that does make sense, actually.
Does it?
I think so. Like, think of how many like jobs and stuff, and just how many things are dependent on having like a healthy population. Like, I don't know if it would be exactly like how it's presented, but like there would be consequences.
Oh, there would be consequences for sure, but the complete lack of suburbs because everyone moved to the city instead? Like, that's what the explanation was. Everyone moved to the city because jobs dried up, because there was no economy, because there were no kids.
In the context of like as like an explanation in a movie, like I'm down I'm willing to go there.
Like, yeah, like, don't get me wrong. Suspension of disbelief, fine. It didn't really bother me that much, but, like, it's kind of a goofy point that I'm just harping on because I'm trying to have fun here, okay? Can't I have some fun?
No fun allowed. We're talking about children in concentration camps, damn it.
God.
Be serious.
But yeah, no, the lineup of the powers is totally absurd. It makes no sense. Like, electricity people aren't bad because, like, they just put rubber gloves on their hands and they're under control. And, like, they're not even, like, hard to take off. Like, at one point I'm thinking, like, all right, you know, maybe when we see them in the concentration camps or something like that, they'll have, like, shackles around them, keeping the rubber gloves on. But, like, we watch Zeus's escape, who's, like, a young girl, and she's just wearing the gloves. She could take them off at any point. She could probably, like, kill half the camp just by sticking a finger out. But nah, man, it's, you know what? The Reds and the telepathics, those are the real dangerous ones.
Well, the fact that the, like, mind readers, the oranges, are the most dangerous, like, that makes sense to me.
Oh, entirely. Yeah.
Like, the ends of the spectrum are correct. It's the middle stuff that feels like it's all pretty much equally destructive in my eyes.
Well, red is considered worse than orange.
No, it's not, I thought.
Yeah, it was.
No, I thought, well, because on the tier...
No, it's like a rainbow. Green, blue, yellow, orange, red.
That makes sense, but I'm having a real, like, Mandela effect now, because I could have swore that orange was at the top.
Fam, it was red.
All right, we're gonna hash this out right now. I'm gonna Google this.
All right, we'll get ready for some action key presses going on.
Here we go. I mean, I guess probably the Wikipedia page will tell us.
This is the podcast content, people.
This is hot steaming content that you come to us for.
Peak fucking beating a dead horse.
All right, I'm gonna keep looking for this. Sean, do you want to talk about the fucking concentration camps? Because I got things to say about it, but why don't you go first?
All right, yeah. So I should really, and now that I have said twice, put the kids back in the concentration camps, I should clarify that it's because it's pretty much the most interesting idea of the movie. It kind of presented itself in a very, pretty standard way. Like, I'm not going to beat around the bush. As I said, Magneto, you know exactly what this is. That said, there would have been some really interesting kind of hijinks and whatnot. And, like, it would have been its own really interesting YA children's movie book in just, like, the escape of a bunch of superpowers working together to get out of a concentration camp, you know? Essentially like a bottle movie where there's only a certain number of characters and, like, you get very familiar with your big bads and, you know, there's growth amongst the characters and whatnot, but it still has a whole dark overtone the entire time. It felt really interesting. And, like, some of the characters, even in those first, like, couple minutes were really interesting and I want to know more about them, but they're just kind of thrown out the window right away. So I was just kind of left like, all right, well, that felt like it was going to be the most interesting thing in the movie. Let's see what else you got. And I was right, I think, in that I do think that was the most interesting part of the movie. I think they had the most room to do things that other YA novels, movies hadn't done before, but they went with the more standard route, which, once again, not necessarily a bad thing. It was fine, but it was fine. Like, it could have been way more interesting, way more unique, a very different perspective, like, with an attempt to say something a bit more than it went out of its way to say, which was, I don't know, friendship, I guess? Themes? I don't know, but...
So, side note, you were completely fucking right, and I'm so mad.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm mad at myself and my brain for not being correct, and I'm questioning everything that I know now, so thanks for that.
Yeah, no problem. That's what I'm here for.
But, more to your point, with the concentration camps, yes, I had a similar feeling that I thought this was going to be, like, you know, where the movie was set. And, you know, it must be stated, of course, that the book would have been written in 2012, and the movie is coming out in 2018, where...
Oh, Jesus. Holy fuck.
Yeah. Yeah, so weirdly prescient in a lot of ways, but also maybe to the movie's detriment that it, engaged with this stuff in a cursory way, because in 2012 that would have just seemed like fantasy, like, oh, like this is just something we can put in as like a backdrop, as kind of like a dark tone setter, and not like a really real ass thing that's happening to kids right now in the United States of America, which is a nightmare.
I have some regrets on things that I have said up to this point in this episode.
I mean, the movie, I mean, you're talking about it as like the plot of a movie.
Entirely, yeah. Like, don't go crapping my words out of context here, people. I'm watching you.
You did say to direct all your hate that you would be the villain of this episode. So.
I did. I will be the heel.
But I guess, oh man, there really are a lot of tangents that keep going on, because I want to talk about tone, but before I do that, like, speaking of the real world connection,
we need to talk about parallel universes.
Fuck you. But the thing is that YA in general kind of has a problem, and this book, I mean, I can't say the book, I haven't read the book. The movie is pretty emblematic of it. In that YA loves its social commentary, which is good. You want to get your teenagers, you want to get the kids like thinking about serious issues. All art is political, and if you're gonna transform young minds, you got to be careful about how you're gonna do that shit. And so that's all fine and dandy. But problem with the dystopia like subgenre in particular is that they really like to have kind of the persecution metaphor, but they also really like to have the fantasy element. And this has been a problem with stories like this since at least X-Men, if not going back further, where you have this persecution, these prisons, these concentration camps, of othering these different people. But the problem is that in the logic of the story, the quote-unquote normal people absolutely have every reason to be afraid of these other people who can, like, melt their minds and, like, change their memories and fuck with them, because that's a big plot point. But in the real life, we don't, because racism and prejudice are not logical. They're fear-driven, based on, like, completely insubstantial, misguided, uninformed, ignorant shit. Like, that's racism in real life. It's like a systemic thing that perpetuates itself that isn't based on any legitimate fear. Whereas, Magneto can, like, tear the world apart in X-Men Apocalypse, using all the metal to give it to Apocalypse. I think there's a pretty good reason to be afraid of him, and that's where the metaphors kind of start to break down to varying degrees. Like, I remember this was a big topic of conversation when Zootopia came out, because there ended up being the way that movie coded its, like, persecution metaphor as, like, the predators and the prey, and using a lot of, like, politically loaded imagery associated with, like, problems that Black Americans have, like people crossing either side of the street and, like, just generally being afraid. That had the unfortunate message that, like, minorities are predators that you should be afraid of, because in the logic of Zootopia, the predators, like, still ate the prey, at least in the past. And there is no, like, that's not the case. If anything, like, the people of color, like, minorities need to be afraid of the majority of white people, because that's how it went down in real life. Colonialism and shit.
Colonialism and shit.
I mean, I think it's a pretty handy way to sum up the history of modern civilization. But yeah, so, I mean, it's not like a huge glaring problem, but it is something that I kind of wish authors thought about, and to its credit, I alluded to the YA scene being different now than it was back then, and like genres, the genres tend to shift with time, as kind of what's popular and like a trend. If there's often like books that come out, and then a lot of books will take inspiration from that, and so now I don't want to say it's a trend, because that feels like it's belittling. But it's more common rather now to have more of a focus on representation in YA, and for that to be kind of the focus of the story. Like, whereas a couple of years ago, dystopias like fantasies were really popular, now contemporary stories are more popular. The best example is the Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. It's been on the New York Times bestseller list for like 74 weeks.
Oh shit, that's
now.
coming out as a movie soon.
I was gonna say, it's a great book. I really love that book, and we should talk about the movie version when it comes out. So times have sort of shifted, and even in books that are more like that have more in common with The Darkest Minds, again, Hate U Give is kind of something completely different, but like Children of Blood and Bone is kind of a dystopian fantasy, and it still kind of has that problem where the central divide in like the class system in that world is one of like magic. So and like the main like antagonist was like, his family was killed by like magi, and like that's why he like hates them. So it's still a bit of a problem, but it's handled with a bit more tact because it was actually written by a person of color, by a woman of color actually. So yeah, and basically YA, if you're gonna try and be socially conscious, make sure you're smart about it, I guess.
Now tie it back to tone, baby.
Oh God, I can't. I've just gone off. There's so much to unpack because All right,
well, let's railroad this into tone. Let's just talk about tone for a little bit.
Okay, so the child concentration camps.
Yes. Gives way to
like road trip adventure, kind of kiddie Mad Max. And when I say that I was charmed by the movie, this is kind of what I was talking about, because once we had shifted away and I kind of realized what we were doing, I was into it. I was like, okay, like this isn't what I expected. It's not going to be the like dark, serious-minded, like politically charged sort of movie. But the thing is that a lot of the surface level stuff was just kind of working for me. Like, just the, obviously it's YA, romance is part of pretty much every book, almost every book. And, you have kind of the awkward teens, like trying to be cute with each other and kind of floundering around, and it's kind of charming. And then
it's cute. Like, we can come out and say it. It's kind of adorable.
It is kind of adorable. And like I didn't use the word awkward to be like belittling, because I think that's what's appealing about it, is that it feels genuinely like a teenage like crush to me, as like they try and dance around it, and like it works. And so then like just the fact that they were going around these like abandoned rural areas, getting chased by Brienne of Tarth child catcher, and it had a great. When I talk about the appeal of YA, and especially these dystopia books, like that's the core of it. Like, we're kids, we're teenagers, we're young adults. Adults, don't understand us. They, are mad about it. I don't have much control over my life, so I'm going to have this fantasy where me and my friends get in a van, and we're going to go run away and have a grand old time, and then we're going to form child outer heaven, which is basically what they do in this. And that's all great. Love that shit. Again, the pacing and like the individual scenes may vary, but like I was here for the tone, charmed by it. The problem is not so much, because for me, the shift from the concentration camps to the road trip feel was a little jarring, but not overbearingly so, because it still had, again, kind of that Mad Max light feel. And
I mean, like, it actually did line up with the original Mad Max pretty well. Like, it just kind of had a sudden twist to it. Yeah, it fit. It worked.
Yeah, and so the problem came in was when we came back to the concentration camp stuff, and with the kind of the ultimate twist, because now we're following along with kind of this light little romance between the leads, and it's cute, and we're having fun and solving puzzles and how to get to outer heaven. And when we get there, we meet the other orange mind control kid, and I mean, just content warning. We're gonna have to talk about sexual assaults. It's one of those.
Yeah.
So this Brock Turner looking motherfucker comes up and he starts talking to our lead hero Ruby, and he's like, "I'm gonna teach you the ways of how to be like a mind reader, and it's gonna be awesome." And you get the feeling that he's gonna be villainous. Like, not everything is as it seems. It's in this, Lord of the Flies children's paradise. And you get that, and, you're kind of ready for that. You're ready for the betrayal of some sorts. But the form that it takes was that while they are, like, I think he's in her mind, she's showing him how to, like, erase memories.
Yep.
And while she's doing that, he tries to rape her. And that's where that was, like, the moment where the movie lost me on its tone. Because, again, as I said, I think YA is a valuable tool for talking about serious subjects. I mean, if it weren't, then The Hate U Give wouldn't have been on the bestseller list for over a year now, like completely straight through. And that you can have a story for teenagers that grapples with sexual assault, but when you do that after having a pretty light, basically adventure story through this, like, wasteland, basically like a road trip movie, and then come back to soldiers in masks, like, gunning everyone down like they're, like the Patriots Strike Force unit. That's when it feels jarring. That's when it feels like things aren't lining up and progressing in a logical fashion. It would be now if the movie had kept the weighty feeling from the beginning in, like, the concentration camps, and actually dealt with this as, like, a character, as characters, instead of using it as just, like, a kind of cheap way, a really cheap way to make it clear that our villain is a bad boy, you can make it work. You can make a story that deals with these kind of abuses, and that would fit in with, the fact that we're being beaten down by the man and these systemic problems, and just fit in with the whole tone of having these serious issues on their mind. But it's like the movie it starts from a serious place, makes itself clear that it's not really going to talk about anything serious, and it's going to be just kind of like a teenage power fantasy, which, again, not knocking that. I think that's valuable in its own right. But then when it comes back to try and be serious again, after not really dealing with it for the whole movie, that's when I think it kind of falls apart. That's what makes it, as I said earlier, a tonal nightmare. That it's fun sandwiched between some really heavy shit.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. And, like, the fact that the first transition works surprisingly well is kind of impressive, given that the second transition just fails spectacularly. And really, I think it has a lot to do with kind of the idea of like tension and release more than anything, because we are opening up with such just dour, sad, depressing things. Like the kid dies, we go to child concentration camps where there's admittedly a lot of other people dying, and then it that tension breaks and it becomes a fun summer road trip movie and we're all happy and having a good time, and then suddenly it comes back and there's not they try and do some build up to it a little bit. Like they have Chubbs kind of notice that he can't escape or something like that. And there's Chubbs is another kid that they're with. I mean, I felt like I should mention that as opposed to just dropping Chubbs.
I mean, I guess to the movie's credit, like until you clarify that, like I didn't even bat an eye at the name. So, to its credit.
But it's like they try and do a build up to it, but it never actually works. Like we're just suddenly there. We're back in the dark zone. It's the shift has already occurred. We're here. We are witnessing an attempted rape, and we are uncomfortable and unsure of what exactly is happening. And it just kind of it comes out of nowhere and slaps you across the face.
Yeah, and because they do attempt the build up, but like so really
it's over like a musical interlude too. We should mention that.
yeah, that is worth mentioning. But I think that's just the musical interlude is just another like that's not the correct payoff for that setup. Like what they're setting up there is mind control boy is a bad boy. But the way they're setting it up is just more like he's generally sort of power hungry, like this is gonna be a Lord of the Flies situation.
He's a dick.
Yeah, or like he's gonna run things like a dictator. Like he's the spoiled president's kid, still wants like the power over things, and like is gonna take some extreme actions. And it's setting it up. Maybe to leave some room even for him to like have a point, like, oh, we got to do these extreme things to survive against this overwhelming enemy.
Kind of like a Magneto thing going on.
Yeah, it's almost like this movie's an inferior X-Men. I mean, not inferior to all the X-Men movies. That's for sure. After hot on the heels of the sexual assault, we get the concentration camps coming back full force, like children screaming and being like subdued, with the ultimate reveal of the fire breathers. Also kind of an underwhelming reveal. I was expecting the Reds to be something much cooler.
Oh yeah, like when they first show up and like they take the mask off and it looks all smoky and wispy, I was expecting like the teleporter dude from My Hero Academia or something like that. That's right, I'm dropping the anime reference this time. What it is.
Sean, the true villain. I've still made I say that this episode is going to be my redemption, but I've still mentioned Metal Gear Solid or something adjacent to it like 20 times now.
Yeah,
so really I'm no better than I've ever been.
But like, yeah, I was definitely expecting more from the fire breathers, and it was immensely disappointing.
Yeah, I guess like the movie just kind of peters out at the end. It feels like that.
I will say, I just have to mention this though too, is if we want to talk about death, she just has the leader of the concentration camp straight up fucking kill himself, which is like a payoff to a movie that stayed in the concentration camp the entire time.
Yes.
In this movie, like, this is the first person we've seen her actually kill. She sent Brienne of Tarth off to walk in the woods, just like the end of X-Men Origins Wolverine, I might add. But she sends her off to walk in the woods, presumably to die of exhaustion or something. But we have her just straight up in a mirror from the beginning where the Orange has a guard kill themselves. Have her kill the big bad concentration camp guard leader guy. Sure, fine. I'm down with the idea of killing the leader of a concentration camp. It's probably a good idea. But for a character beat in a movie that has been so lighthearted, it's incredibly dark and wildly out of place. Like, it doesn't feel like she should be a killer at this point at all, and yet she's just fine with it.
I'm glad you mentioned this because I completely agree with everything you just said. But I also wanted to add that the moment where she sends Brienne of Tarth running off was also jarring to me in the same way. And I thought that would maybe be the moment, like, things started to get dark and we kind of returned, like, we had our moment of levity, and, like, we're gonna mix the tones more evenly now and, like, kind of deal with the consequences of this. But, like, the movie doesn't really acknowledge how fucked up what she just did to that woman was.
No, yeah, I was kind of in the same boat where I'm like, oh, wow, that's a little fucked up. I'm kind of more concerned with how much it just apes X-Men Origins, but all right. And I kind of like wrote it off. It's just like, all right, sure, that was a little bit of weirdness, but like, you know, it was a tense moment for her. We can move on. She didn't necessarily kill her outright. It was dark, but like I could see that as a way for someone in her position to reconcile killing someone, like, you know, getting over that cognitive dissonance of it. And like it was fine. Much like a lot of the movie, it was fine. And then it pays off with the death of him, and it's just wild.
I think, you know, thinking about it more, I think having the bounty hunter run off into the woods, I think it's a fine illustrative example of how a movie can manage multiple tones. Because I've praised movies that do this in the past, like Sorry to Bother You being the most recent one. And, you know, that movie has some real shit and some moments of real goofiness. But it manages to mix them pretty seamlessly, so it never feels too jarring. And I think, as just a general rule, the key is that when you have some real stuff, like, it needs to be treated with the, like, seriousness and deal with, like, the fallout of what's actually happening in the story. I don't know if there's any, like, jump between something goofy and something serious that is so large that it can't be overcome with the proper handling, but every individual element needs to be in place. So, like, with that scene, the fact that we never really come back to it in any meaningful way is what makes it weird. The fact that the tone is jarring from, like, fun kids on a road trip to, like, sentencing this woman to a pretty horrible death. The fact that it's jarring is not necessarily a fault in the movie itself, because that feeling of that jarring feeling can be very effective, like, because the fun road trip is very disarming, and it gets you kind of feeling in this secure place, whereas the sending her to her death is a moment of, you know, profound seriousness. But then the problem is the movie doesn't do anything interesting with that disconnect. I
don't think it would even need to do anything interesting with it. I think all we would really need is just like a conversation to ask her how she's doing. Like a little bit like, hey, you kind of just did something crazy there. Are you handling it okay? You just killed a person. Let's talk about this. Let's embrace this and understand what the consequences for that are. Not just, all right, cool, we're good now. We're going to have a brief misunderstanding and then be best friends and go on.
You know what? Like, now that I'm thinking about it, I wonder if that's another thing, because what we're basically talking about is like a failure on the filmmaker's part to really engage with the implications that this has on Ruby's character. And maybe this is another thing that's just lost in translation, lost in adaptation, because with the first-person narration, you don't necessarily need an external scene to see how that would be affecting her. Like, it could be something that's entirely interior and something that the other members of the team wouldn't think much about. So, again, not having read the book, I couldn't say, but that definitely is the thing you gotta watch out for when you're doing an adaptation. Make sure it doesn't come off as completely callous.
Yeah. Oh, you know what we need to talk about before we wrap everything up?
Oh, do tell.
We need to talk about, like, the death that actually, like, seemed to have the most impact in the movie. Like, the one that they kind of lingered on for a little bit and had a little bit of a discussion about and really kind of debated a little bit. The death of the fucking car. And, like, I realize that this sounds like a joke, and it is largely set up as such, but it is really what they focus on the most as far as things that have died. Like, everything else is kind of glossed over, but, like, they're like, we have to get rid of this car, and then they spend a couple minutes joking about how do we get rid of it? Is it okay to just leave it here? Should we go and do something with it? Should we, Viking burial it type of deal? Which is more consideration than they have given anything else in this movie.
Yeah, because all the human characters that die are either the bad guys, so we don't care about them, or are
kids that we just don't care about.
I was gonna say bit players that, like, none of the main characters die. Yeah. So really, that's
except Chubbs, who gets lightly singed and is apparently in a coma.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. He gets a little burned. Come on, Chubbs, walk it off. You're in a post-apocalypse now.
I was gonna say, we if you're gonna have your character get, like, badly burned or something like that, this is an action movie. Like, we're expecting it to be in a big way or something like that, and he just kind of looks like his back gets burned a little bit, and, like, he's like, all right, well, now I'm dying, so I'm gonna go into a coma now. Bye. And, like, it doesn't look like he really, in real life, yeah, he would have been hurt as fuck. But for the context of a movie with superhero children, he looks moderately singed.
So that might be another thing, thinking about the adaptation process.
He gets shot.
What?
He gets shot in the adaptation.
Oh, does he?
In the book. Yeah.
Oh,
so, like, it makes more sense. I'm just gonna straight up answer what you're about to ask. He gets shot.
Well, thank you. But either way, if it was still burning in the book, I think it works. Kind of what I wanted to mention works either way is that this is one of the areas where, just in general, there is a disconnect between YA books and YA movies, and why I think
you mean YA think.
Oh. Well, this has been Beating a Dead Horse, everyone. I gotta go kill Sean. The only logical finale to this podcast. The thing about YA books, let's use The Hunger Games as an example, and that the Hunger Games movie was very much criticized for being this, supposed blood sport where they had to keep the teenage girl audience, and so therefore they couldn't make it too gory, so they wouldn't be R. But the book doesn't have that problem because the book's just descriptions, so you can make your kills as horrible as you want. And I remember there's some stuff that I read in one of the Hunger Games books, I think. Spoilers for the third Hunger Games. But her little sister just gets fucking blown up. Like, she gets a bomb dropped on her and incinerated, like, right before her eyes. It's messed up. There's a lot of messed up shit happens in those books. And, the movie, just from this is why the book's always better than the movie, fan, because Hollywood's gonna sanitize and make everything worse. But I mean, actually, that is kind of the case right now. So yeah. So basically, this is my plea on that note. Is that if you are the kind of person who dismisses YA, young adult fiction, young adult movies out of hand, I encourage you to rethink your stance, because the fact that the movies, the only difference between, like, The Darkest Minds and, like, an X-Men movie is that the X-Men movie was made for teenage boys in mind, and The Darkest Minds was made for teenage girls in mind. And
they're the exact same thing.
That's about it. And I think you should really examine why you're being so harsh, why you think something like The Darkest Minds would be the, like, death of filmmaking.
Because Twilight is stupid.
No, exactly. And that's the tone I was seeing in a lot of reviews. And so I would do some introspection, and also, like, if your only exposure, like, on that point, if your only exposure to this YA stuff has been the movies, like, I get it. Like, I watched the first Hunger Games when I was a teenager, and I didn't like it, but then I went back and read the book, and I liked it a lot. because there was a lot more to it than just what we were seeing in the movies. So if you are the sort of person who hasn't actually like ever picked up one of these books and seen what's going on, I'm not telling you that if it's not your cup of tea that you gotta be all clicked in with what the kids are into or whatever. But if you're gonna go around, don't criticize something that you aren't going to really engage with and just dismiss out of hand, especially if you're going to base it only on the adaptations and not like the actual original works that are more meaningful to people. So that's my humble plea from someone who is invested in YA, who likes YA. Yeah, you should not that you can't have criticisms, not that you can't have opinions, but just make sure you're not just being a sexist who hates teenage girls.
It was a fine movie. There's nothing wrong with that. I put it on par with the X-Men movies. It was good. Don't hate.
It was definitely better than X-Men Apocalypse. Fuck.
Anything's better than X-Men Apocalypse. We should talk about that at some point because I love that movie in the worst possible way.
All right, deal.
I've been Sean McKinda. You can find me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda. I also have a website where I reviews and stuff. And speaking of, sexism against young girls, I wrote a review about 8th Grade, the movie that is so painful I watched it through my fingers. It's incredible. Go watch that fucking movie. It's revolutionary. But I wrote a review of it. And you should go check it out on my website, isortof.com. I have all my reviews there. It's also where you can find my Twitch streams and some other stuff that I just kind of work off on the side. So go check that out.
And I'm Jackson Keller. You can find me over on Twitter at JacksonJKeller, where I am on there less, as I have mentioned. But I am still checking in to see if people leave me comments and want to have a little chat. So don't be afraid to say hi.
Yeah. The podcast had a nice chat last week with somebody who was talking about Mission Impossible Fallout and how it's a really good movie. So don't be afraid to come do that with us. We love having those conversations. And if you want to do that with the podcast, you can follow us at BADH_cast. Big special shout out this week to Art Your Way Foundation. This is kind of a totally new thing that is just cropping up in the Columbus area. So if you are in the Columbus area and want to go to something this Friday night, they're doing a fundraiser. This is a brand new thing. It's all about basically bullying and overcoming bullying through art and whatnot. It's really cool. Great people working it. They are doing a fundraiser at Wild Goose Creative in Columbus. That's down on Summit near the downtown area. Come hang out. It's $20 online, $25 at the door. I'll post links online to get a free drink with that and everything like that. It's a silent auction. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on there. Really cool. If you are not in Columbus, or this also applies to people who are in Columbus and haven't yet, I'm also going to throw links down below to their Facebook page and Twitter page. Go follow them, give them a like, help them out any way that you can. This is a great cause, all about like not bullying and stuff like that, which is, an episode where I yelled about how we should put children in concentration camps, a great place for it, because bullying is fucking terrible and needs to be stopped, and art's a great way of getting around that. So go support them in whatever way you can. Also, usual shoutouts to 25yearslatersite.com for hosting this. We appreciate you guys immensely. They have a great website full of cult TV, movies, and a bunch of other stuff. Huge focus on David Lynch, but they're branching out in a bunch of new, awesome ways. Also, shoutouts to Lords of the Highway for the use of our theme song. It is Suicide, alternate take off the album High Octane, Low Expectations. They're on Spotify. They're in a bunch of places. Go check them out. They're awesome. And next week is going to be something special. I don't really know how it's going to go yet, but just trust us, you're going to want to be here for it.
We will come out of this either as legends or as pariahs. There will be no middle ground, so be here to witness either our glorious rise or terrible downfall.
It'll either be the beginning of the rest of our lives or the last episode of Beating a Dead Horse. Bye.
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go